there's nothing difficult in the book of Revelation. Honestly, it's easier to understand than books like Ezekiel and Isaiah that use denser imagery. None of the book is in code. Nearly every image used in Revelation appears elsewhere in the Bible, and the context tells us how it's being used. We'll tackle these symbols as we go, but the main one we need to understand early on is the number 7. It appears 57 times in the book, and I'm about to argue for a 58th. This isn't a code. Math as we know it did not exist when this book was written. Numbers and nearly all the complex mathematical calculations we had to learn come much later in history. The Hebrews were doing a few simple arithmetic exercises at this point, and Revelation has nearly all of them in it. 3, 4, 10, 12 all tell you how to read the passage. 3 is for emphasis. 4 tells us something will continue to increase. 10 signifies importance, a list to be memorized. 12 is summation, literally pay attention to the last number. And 7 is the number of transition. A sequence of 7 in Hebrew literature is meant to draw attention to the change that is taking place. So it's saying, why is 2 different than 1? Why is 5 different than 3? It's plotting a trajectory, and it wants you to understand why something is taking that particular course. Now, the 7s in Revelation tend to be of a specific type. 6 and arrest. 1, they bookend the 7 days of Genesis. The 7 days of Genesis plot a course of God adding complexity, of bringing order out of chaos. Our main 7 lists in Revelation are all going to trace this in reverse. Man bringing chaos out of God's order, destroying what God created. And we're going to get 6 integers of change and a final resting integer. What happens and then what it leads to. All of this to attempt to answer a single question. And no, the question is not when does the world end. The question is why does this, a guy teaching the world how to live the way they were designed to live, lead ultimately to the end of the world? And I promise that is the topic. That's what it focuses on over and over. Spoiler alert, of course, it's not directly the fault of Jesus. It's that his teaching is going to create a much more orderly, much more powerful world. This world will become proud, and pride goes before the fall. That's the book in a nutshell. Let's get right into it. The first major 7, the one where we plot a course, is the 7 churches found in Revelation chapter 2 and 3. 7 churches, 7 different stages of development. A type of development that we see time and time again in history. It happens both in small settings like individual churches, and it happens in societies at large. So I'm going to go through each and give an example of each, both big examples with major cultural shifts and small examples with the church I grew up in, which went through all 7 of these stages. Stage 1, Ephesus, the baby church. At first, the description we get here sounds like a riddle. How can they've already lost their first love if they're brand new? The answer is simple. Every major religion where we know their origin looks very similar at the outset, and I mean visually, from the outside, not in terms of their beliefs. But if you were just to look at everything from early Christianity to early Islam to early Buddhism, you would have thought, hey, all these things look alike. And they all look like Woodstock. Literally, they all looked like hippies running around outdoors, singing and having a good time. Lots of exuberant spirituality. Not a lot of rules. Now, they can't stay like that. There's more to life than singing and banging drums in the forest. Spread your ideas and you're going to have to lay down roots. There's going to have to be some guidelines, some things that allow for basic social order inside of these growing groups. This passage warns the early churches as they lay down those roots, they need to maintain a connection back to their early, spiritually exuberant days. Now for my examples. Big example, small example. Big. This is one of the major features that separated early Christianity from other religions. In the East, Buddhism, Taoism, they faced inward. All spiritual connection all the time. Monks, what we call aestheticism. In the West, it was just the opposite. With pagan temples, the emphasis tended to always be pointed outward, demanding everyone make proper sacrifice to the gods. But the priests generally didn't spend a lot of time and energy off by themselves attempting to obtain some deeper spiritual union. Christianity, from very early on, had both. It had monasteries with monks and nuns, and it had priests reaching outward to the lay populations. Like the Revelation passage said, when it talked about churches that didn't do both, their lampstands were snuffed out. Lampstands here represents the church's impact on society around them. The Christian communities that were all aesthetic, all inward, never grew and eventually died out. The ones that were all outward, not connected to any cloistered communities that had separated from society, well, those churches were changed, altered by society around them. They ceased to be Christian. The ones that did both, that had both, grew because they interacted with society, and also because they didn't lose their first love. They still had that joyous spirituality. They were still connected to those communities that were facing inward, that were focused on that sort of thing. The communities that had both, those churches, they moved on to the next stage. Small example. The church I grew up in was very outward facing, always trying to be warm and inviting to newcomers, but it also had family camps. These weekends where anyone who wanted could go, but it tended to only be the core committed families who actually did. And what did? We went to a campground out in the woods and for a few days acted like the early Christians. It was a sort of Christian Woodstock. It was a lot of fun. Some of my best childhood memories, and it gave that church a core of people who were not simply rooted to the culture around them. Thus, my church moved on to the next stage. Stage 2, Smyrna. We're told they live where Satan lives. So this is a church that is now impacting, now changing the society around it. This is the stage that begins the process that we call Christianization, the process where societies around these churches experience a change in values that begin to mirror Christian values. This is what it means when it says, you think you're poor, but you are rich. It's saying you don't have what society values, but just wait. Society is about to start valuing something else. And the things it's going to start valuing are the things that you do have. Big example. This is only hard because where do I start? It happened all over the world. Culture after culture encountered Christianity and the things they valued as a culture changed to match Christian values. For the sake of time, I'm just going to do one oddball example to give you an idea. Japan. It's not what you would call a Christian nation, but they have undergone Christianization. One of the most visible examples of this is marriage. In traditional Japanese marriages, the union looks a lot like a business transaction, and historically, often the husband and wife didn't even live together. Christianity spread, essentially, by presenting itself as a more attractive alternative to the beliefs around it. In Japan, Christian marriage is now typically seen as the more attractive alternative. And so, even though most Japanese wouldn't call themselves Christians, you get these little purpose-built marriage chapels, where Japanese couples can enter into Christian marriages, defined by Christian values. Small example. My church had a nice focus on service and missions. It took part in shaping the culture around it. This is typical. If you spent any time in church, you probably know just what I'm talking about. So I'll move on. Stage 3, Pergamum. This church is still on the front lines of the culture wars, but now we're starting to see some cracks form in the edifice of Christianity. Christianity isn't compromising with the culture, not yet, but it's doing two things that are going to cause it to compromise later on. And these things are symbolized with Balaam and with the Nicolaitans. Going into the story of Balaam would take time. I might make it its own video at some point. Balaam, son of Beor, was a famous guy. We know him from sources outside the Bible. Balaam was a kind of Einstein figure in his day, the wisest of wise men. Balaam caused the early Hebrews to sin by bringing in prostitutes, but lots of people brought temptation. The significance of Balaam is that he was a cultural icon. This would represent an attitude where now you're concerned how people are looking at you. Oh, I'm not that kind of Christian. I'm not strange like those people. The Nicolaitans were prostitutes. Well, they employed prostitution as part of their ceremonies. This was big in paganism at the time. How else were you going to lure people to sacrifice in your temple? And that's the significance. Here, the church is trying to lure people into the faith, not just attract them with the truth of Christianity. Big example, again, where do I start? On the continent, they did this literally, turning orphanages into brothels during the Middle Ages. More broadly, it reflects things like the development of Christmas and Easter, both adapted from pagan festivals. And though they seem to have started out with a fairly noble goal of reaching people where they were right then and there, we can see how they've changed over the ages, especially with something like Christmas and what's become a very consumer-oriented focus. Small example. About the time I went off to college, my church started hosting game nights for the high schoolers. A nice way to bring in new people, right? Except they did it in the most deceptive way possible. No mention of the sermon that would be taught after some game time. And when it came time for the lesson, they locked the doors and told the kids that if any of them tried to leave, they'd be committing curfew violations. Why didn't they just cover a pit with leaves? I have no idea. Stage 4. Thyatira. The church feminized. The passage says they tolerate that woman Jezebel. Jezebel is the dragon lady of the Old Testament, the one married to King Ahab. She manipulated him into doing some really silly stuff. Big example. This happens several times in history, and it gets covered again later in the book of Revelation. So for now, let me just say this. Manhood does not mean adulthood. It refers to a male who has taken on a level of responsibility for dealing with threats, internal and external. At this stage, the society has been Christianized, which, among other things, means that Christianity has knocked down a lot of those obvious threats, and now society begins to reject the need for genuine manhood. It doesn't see the threat anymore. And when the next threat arrives, as it always does, the weakened society becomes dependent on the nearest warrior culture that still contains manhood, in order to save it. This happens to Rome, it happens to Europe more than once. Eventually, it will happen again, and there will be no one left to come in and storm the beaches at Normandy. But that comes later in the videos. Small example. My church lost its pastor. He wasn't an obvious man's man, but he fit the biblical definition, and once he was gone, they couldn't find a quality replacement. This sent them to the next stage, which is not a good place to be. Stage 5, Sardis. You think you are alive, but you are dead. This is the church that no longer moves the culture. Mostly it's dead. It does have a few people that are still faithful, and those are the people that are going to move it on to stage 6. Big example, one of the best examples of this is a guy named Jan Hus, the Bohemian preacher who spoke out against church corruption in the early 1400s. Before him, there were plenty of reformers, but they all had lots of help. There were popes who were reformers, and they always had major support from some cardinals and bishops. Not long after Jan Hus, speaking out the way he did would put you in stage 6, which I'll explain in just a second. Small example. We couldn't replace our pastor, but we did have a few interesting part-timers, but it didn't last. Stage 6, Philadelphia. This is the church drawn out. If you want to make the case for a pre-tribulation rapture, this is your moment. Quick, before all the later passages that make it sound like what the believers are escaping is the moral decay of the Great Tribulation, not the actual experience of it. Big example, we call this the Protestant Reformation. The people who no longer wished to connect themselves to a decaying church moved out and formed their own denominations. Small example, all those core families that went to family camp back in stage 1, they left the church I grew up in. Seriously, I don't know of a single one that stayed. They left and they scattered all over to various other churches. Last one, stage 7, Laodicea, the church dead. This group gets one of the Bible's most memorable rebukes. I wish you were hot or cold. As you are, I just want to spit you out. This church doesn't change the culture, doesn't impact the culture. This church is the culture. And even though this culture is Christianized, now it's without its original spiritual connection. It's nothing more than a perversion of its former self. And this is what will lead to the destruction we're going to find in later chapters of this book. Big example. America is almost there. Almost where? What Christianity is to a place like France, where still something like 60% would check the box, but it means nothing to them. They call themselves Christians because their parents did. It does nothing to change their thinking or their lives. Small example, the church I grew up in it no longer exists. A few years ago, it closed its doors forever. 7 churches, 7 stages, tracing a path from vibrant beginnings to a kind of culturally inert, comatose ending, all showing a trajectory of a world that essentially becomes a victim of its own success. It becomes proud, and as we'll see later, this pride leads to massive worldwide destruction. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Our second book, Fluid Shock, is now available from our publisher or from Amazon. Don't miss the next book in our award-winning pandemic horror series, The Holocaust Engine. Link below.